like we did with one of our previous texts, we're going to do our close reading of the Treatise of Human Nature in this format, just so it's something that you can refer back to, especially when it comes time for revision, both for this SAC as well as the exam. So kind of like what we did when we did close readings in class, I'm just going to go through the text and kind of explain key points as we get to them. I'll give you a bit of an idea of where the element I'm talking about is. Let's get reading. There are some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain, beyond the evidence of a demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. Okay, so even just here, the idea that they're trying to talk about is that this is kind of the current prevailing view of personal identity. This would be kind of Descartes and Locke, who posit a single enduring self at the center of our experiences. So this will be touched on a little bit more, but this is really just introducing the idea of perceiving, perception, knowing, and being aware of our existence, and classification of self as self-evident, pretty much. That we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain, beyond the evidence of demonstration, both of its perfect identity and simplicity. The strongest sensation, the most violent passion, say they, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely and make us consider their influence on self either by their pain or pleasure. To attempt a farther proof of this were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from any fact of which we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain if we doubt of this. So it's talking about the capability of pain and pleasure as factors in self-identification. So we can say there is a singular self, and this concept of having pain, feeling pleasure, help in making us feel as though there is a single self, that there is this person, which I say that I am, who is affected by and identified by being this self that can be seen as most evident, can be seen as a single enduring self at the center of all of our experiences. So on to paragraph 2. This is kind of, now we're talking about denial of this initial claim. Unluckily, all of these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is here explained. For from what impression could this idea be derived? This question 'tis impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity, and yet 'tis a question which must necessarily be answered, if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible. So what they're saying here is kind of linked back to the view of personal identity from the first paragraph, where they're saying this simplicity, this perfect self concept of a single enduring self, and the claim that our experience and the way that we experience things in this kind of ever-changing manner, and not as a singular thing that is always occurring, is contrary to that idea of a explainable, specifiable self. If there is such a self, pretty much, that we can pinpoint, says Hume, it must be a single changeless impression lying behind all other experiences. But there is no impression like this. This kind of leads us to the next line we're about to read. So it must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of the self, that impression must continue invariably the same, through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. So just pausing here for a sec, our concept of self, he's saying, isn't from a single thing, but instead it's from many that are taken together, and in reference to each other, they talk about the self. Not one single thing. Again, it's the combination is where he's leading in. And this is, as we'll know from previous readings, where he'll kind of later lead into the bundle theory. But right now, his initial stance is essentially that because the self must be a constant, stable thing, and yet all of our knowledge comes from changing, shifting impressions, it follows that we cannot have knowledge of a self, and therefore there is no self. This is that point that he makes here. So, but there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passion and sensations succeed each other, and never all exist at the same time. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions, or from any other, that the idea of the self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. So this line at the bottom especially is very, very important. It cannot therefore be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of the self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. So pretty much it's saying there is no self, or not at least one that we can be certain of, because there is no singular impression that is giving us this idea of the self that we can derive the self from. So it's not pain or pleasure, it's not grief or joy, it's not passion or any other sensations that we're succeeding each other. None of these give rise to the idea of the self. And as such, we can say that there is no impression or idea that derives the self. This kind of leads us to this question of how can we have a stable self if there isn't a stable impression that we can always refer back to. But Father, what must become of all our particular perceptions upon this hypothesis? All of these are different and distinguishable and separable from each other, and may be separately considered, and may exist separately, and have no need of anything to support their existence. What he's talking about here, so like, what does this mean for our perceptions, is what he's asking. And it says that really all our perceptions are different and they're separate, and they don't need anything else to support them. We take them as this concept of acknowledging and accepting what is being said to be happening, that we have these perceptions. We don't need to we take these perceptions and we kind of just accept them on face value, that they are these things that are distinguishable. We can experience one moment and a separate moment and say that they actually are different and distinguishable. We have this idea of one perception versus another perception. That's where we're saying they're separate, and they are thus separable, distinguishable, and separately considered. He leads on to talk about, so after what manner, therefore, do they belong to the self, and how are they connected with it? For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I will always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound asleep, so long am I insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. So this element in general is very important. This part here where it's talking about when I look most intimately into myself, so when I'm kind of introspective, I'm looking deep down, kind of thinking about myself, well, I'm always perceiving something. And even trying to think of a self inside is done via perceiving. We can only really ever look in and discover perceptions. We can never really perceive the self as such, or the person doing the perception. What he says here, where he says I can never catch myself at any time without a perception and can never observe anything but the perception. This is what he means by saying that, well, there isn't something seemingly deep down and separate from perception. All I can observe and all that I can understand or experience are perceptions, and there are always current some form of a perception going on, and it's multiple and it's fluctuating and it's changing, but there is always some form of a perception. And thus, when I look deep down into myself, I never see this kind of person behind the perceptions. I only ever see the actual perceptions themselves. It's on to the next part. So, when my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound asleep, so long am I insensible of myself and may truly be said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate, after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely alienated, nor do I conceive what is farther requisite to make me a perfect non-identity. What he's saying here is this idea of, in the strict view of Hume's theory, you can say in sound asleep, I can in theory be taken to not exist. So no perception equals no self. That's really the major element here. Perception is required for there to be a self. So when my perception is removed, or when I'm sound asleep, so that I'm not, aware of or conscious of what is going on, I could be said not to exist, because no perception, no self. This, by the same logic, is how we consider death. Death is the end of existence for Hume. He says that there is essentially no life after death. There, again, the absence of perception means there is no self. I cease to exist without perception. He goes on a little bit where he's talking about the reflection of others. So if anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me. So it's kind of just being like an offhand, well, they may think this, but I don't agree with that, and I just wouldn't feel comfortable saying that we have the similar principles, because I can no longer reason with him if he doesn't accept kind of my version of it. He has a different notion than I, and I feel as though we are different in this understanding and this idea as a result. So this leads us on to paragraph 4. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. These lines that I just read are some of the most important of the text. This is his version of a theory of the self. So this is the bundle theory. I may affirm to the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an increasingly inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and motion. So this is the self as a bundle of perceptions. The self is but an amalgamation or a combination of perceptions. They're ever-changing and they're widely different, and at any given moment, they aren't fixed. That is especially that changing and not fixed is something that is really important to Hume. The idea that our self and this bundle of perceptions is always changing, always in movement, is key to his differences between himself and Locke as well. Perpetual flux, always moving, always changing, not a stable, consistent, a variable and ever-changing. So where that leads us, our eyes cannot turn in their sockets without varying our perceptions. Our thought is still more variable than our sight, and all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change. So what he's kind of talking about, this idea of, there's always changes in our perception. When I'm looking at something and I move my eyes, I see something different than I did a second ago, and I have different perceptions. So when our eyes move, our perceptions change and our thoughts change even more so. So where there's so many things going through people's brains constantly, your thoughts kind of tumble over each other. There's so many times where you just have your mind is going 1,000,000 miles a minute, and we talk about that sometimes, and that obviously is an exaggeration, but it's so evident to the human experience of having so much going on, and that feels self-evident because it's something we've all experienced, of this kind of idea of just having like 1,000,000 thoughts going on. And that's what Hume's kind of relying on and kind of trying to draw out, is thinking about, well, our experience is always changing, our perceptions are always changing, and our self, or this illusion of personal identity, is based on these perceptions. So shouldn't our self, then our personal identity, be said to be shifting and changing and constantly variable, constantly moving, sorry. So it goes on, our thought is still more variable than our sight, and our other senses and faculties contribute to this change, nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. The mind is a kind of theatre. So wait, we'll leave that for just 1 second. So what he means is there's no evidence of a core. So this idea of the all our other senses and faculties contribute to this change, nor is there any single power of the soul which remains unalterably the same, perhaps for one moment. So there's no evidence of a core or like a soul in his view, that we thus cannot be seen as something beyond, and thus cannot be seen as something beyond simply those perceptions. So what he means, there's no singular, unchanging core to align the self with. And in form of that, that means that there's no personal identity, because there is this lack of a unified, simple self that can be identified at a time, and neither can there be a self which persists through time. That is kind of where this leads to. So looking at this mind as a kind of theatre, this is a example that he gives that is a bit of an analogy to what he's talking about as a concept of this ever-changing bundle of perceptions. So the mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successively make their appearances, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity indifferent, whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity. The comparison of the theatre must not mislead us. They are the successive perceptions only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these scenes are represented, or the materials of which is composed. So there's two kind of important elements here. So the first is like this idea of the mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successfully make their appearances. So this kind of point here. What he's saying is like the idea of the theatre or the audience as such is an analogy for the many changing perceptions. So just like you'll have different actors going through and having their moment and having their appearances, so too do you have different perceptions that are successively going on, performing, having their moment, and then leaving. So the perceptions come in, we experience this perception, and perception leaves. That's this idea of like the theatre, the performance. It's always successive. Something goes on after another. They go one appearance after another, after another. In this idea of ever-changing perceptions. The key kind of part of this, however, I feel, is this bottom section here where you'll see it shows the comparison of the theatre must not mislead us. They are the successive perceptions only that constitute the mind, nor have we the most distant notion of the place where these things are represented or the materials of which composed. This last part of not having the notion of the place where these scenes are represented or the materials pretty much just kind of talks about this idea of we don't know where the perceptions are taking place, and we only know that the perception is occurring. So the perception of having the perception. It's almost this idea of like mind's eye. Like think about those concepts of people say when you imagine something in your head, where is that thing that you're imagining? And that's a question of like the mind and this idea of the immaterial that we don't have this solid answer to. So when we talk about the self, that is also one of those immaterial things that is our concept applied to something that is going on. So if we don't even really understand where the self is or where these perceptions are taking place, it kind of almost also takes away from having this simple unified self that we can identify both at a time and over time. So it again leads into this, because there is a no simple unified self that can be identified at a time, neither can there be a self that kind of persists through time. So there's no personal identity. That's where we kind of leave paragraph 4 is, well, there is no specific singular self. This bundle theory idea is simply saying that there are a collection of successive different perceptions which are in rapid succession, always moving, always fluctuating. There is no personal identity of a singular consistent self. So where paragraph 5 then leads us is a bit about this idea of like, if the self is merely this bundle of ever-changing perceptions, then why do we believe we have this identity, or why do we think there is an identity over time? So what then gives us so great a propension to ascribe an identity to these successive perceptions, and to suppose ourselves posits of an invariable and uninterrupted existence through the whole course of our lives? In order to answer this question, we must distinguish betwixt personal identity and it regards our thought or imagination, and it regards our passions or the concern we take in ourselves. So what it's saying here, so personal identity in terms of like thoughts and imaginings versus concern for like the body. The first is our present subject, and to explain it perfectly, we must take the matter pretty deep and account for the identity which we attribute to plants and animals, there being a great analogy betwixt it and the identity of the self or person. So what it's saying, in order to understand why we tend to attribute identity to the self or person over time, is helpful to examine the supposed identity of plants and animal. For the illusion of personal identity is analogous to the illusion of identity of plants and animals. And this is usually how we regard, say, like the physical, this idea of things like sameness, resemblance, causation, contiguity, which is about to come up. So lots of this then starts in paragraph 6, which we'll read now. So we have a distinct idea of an object that remains invariable and uninterrupted through a supposed variation of time, and this idea we call that of identity or sameness. What saying is, we tend to conflate identity or sameness in which an object persists unchanged through time. We also have a distinct idea of several different objects existing in succession and connected together by a close relation, and this, to an accurate view, affords as perfect a notion of diversity as if there was no manner of relation among the objects. So what he's saying is, we kind of run together this notion of an object that remains the same over time with different interrupted but related objects which succeed one another. So we're kind of positing identity from something that really shouldn't be said to be the same. So an idea here, so obviously it says diversity here, and this kind of, oh, well, it's this notion of diversity. If we utilize this, then it's the same as saying there is no manner of relation. What he's talking about here, the diversity is kind of this idea in which several related objects exist in succession, but they are not the same thing. So in an effort to justify how distinct objects can be treated as one object that persists through time, something that we utilize, and what he's about to talk about, is that we talk about notions of the soul or the self or substance as means of connecting those distinct objects. Even when we resist such fictions, we are led to suppose something connecting the parts beside their relation. Like this idea of like related objects. But though these, so we're up to here, but though these two ideas of identity and the succession of related objects be in themselves perfectly distinct and even contrary, yet it is certain that in our common way of thinking they are generally confounded with each other. That act of imagination by which we consider the uninterrupted and invariable object, and that by which we reflect on the succession of related objects, are almost the same to the feeling, nor is there much more effort of thought required in the latter case than in the former. This is just kind of linking the idea of sameness and relation of objects, so almost contiguity or continuity in the succession of related objects. Makes it feel as though they are the same thing connected over time. Going on, the relation facilitates the transition of the mind from one object to another and renders its passage as smooth as if it was contemplated one continued object. So this kind of allows for a bit of like transfers of mind almost. So we could say that if the mind goes from one thing to another, and this is very much like a Locke view implication, we could say that it renders, like it says here, its passage is smooth as if it was contemplated one continued object. So if we allow for this self idea and this identity concept to be considered in objects that are interrupted and invariable, as Locke would, because it's about, in his opinion, it's about memory and the consciousness staying the same, is the same self. Well, then this is kind of this issue of, well, it then causes confusion and mistake. So that line here where it says, this resemblance is the cause of confusion and mistake and makes us substitute the notion of identity instead of that of related objects. So what Hume would see in this concept of like interruptions and changes is that it wouldn't be said to be the same self in all of those periods. When there is a change or an interruption, we can't be said to be the same self. So what he means here is that it's like an implication that Locke's view of personal identity is flawed, mistaking personal identity with mere relation. This allowance of interruptions to the self, he would say, is flawed logic. How can it be possible or accurate if this idea of an interrupted, variable self is allowed? This kind of leads on further down when we look at this. However, we may at one instant consider the related succession of variable or interrupted. We are sure the next to ascribe to it perfect identity and regard it as invariable or uninterrupted. So how can we kind of go back on saying that it is changing, that it is variable? We can't then say, oh, at one moment it was interrupted, there was gaps, there was these issues, but now it is fine, and now it is again a perfect identity which is unchanging and uninterrupted. It seems as though there is an issue. So our propensity to this mistake is so great from the resemblance above mentioned that we fall into it before we are aware, and though we incessantly correct ourselves by reflection and return to a more accurate method of thinking, yet we cannot long sustain our philosophy or take off this bias from the imagination. Our last resource is to yield to it and to boldly assert that these different related objects are in effect the same, however interrupted and variable. In order to justify to ourselves this absurdity, we often feign some new and unintelligible principle that connects the objects together and prevents their interruption or variation. So this kind of whole section here where we talk about yielding to it and accepting and understanding this kind of idea is very much Locke's view. So accepting that there are interruptions and variables is very much Locke's concept of gappiness, that there is an allowance for gaps and interruptions in our memory, as long as we do have some past memories and ideas and our consciousness is the same. When he talks about a new or an intelligible principle that connects these objects together and prevents their interruption or variation, this is when he talks about memory and consciousness elements for Locke. So think about those even quasi-memory elements we talked about. If I remember a moment from myself 5 years ago, and myself 5 years ago remembered a moment from myself 5 years prior to that, then I now, even if I do not remember the 10 years ago prior event, can be said to be the same self because there is this quasi-memory through a different version of myself having that memory. So where this kind of then leads us, starting here. So thus we feign the continued existence of the perceptions of the senses to remove the interruption and run into the notion of a soul, a self, and substance to disguise the variation. So pretty much in an effort to justify how distinct objects can be treated as one object that persists through time, Hume says that we kind of bring up these fictional notions of the soul, the self, or substance, and they're employed as generally a means of connecting the distinct objects, so the distinct different elements present in time that we posit and in Locke's view say are the same self, but to Hume are actually just differing distinct objects. But we may further observe that where we do not give rise to such a fiction, our propension to confound identity with relation is so great that we are apt to imagine something unknown and mysterious connecting the parts beside their relation. And this I take to be the case with regard to the identity we ascribe to plants and animals. And even, I'll scroll down, when this does not take place, we still feel a propensity to confound these ideas, though we are not able fully to satisfy ourselves in that particular, nor find anything invariable and uninterrupted to justify our notion of identity. So, key part of this paragraph that he's mentioned time and time again here he brings up two necessary conditions of identity, and these we've talked about in class. And this is this idea that an object must be invariable and uninterrupted, and you'll see it's written here, just justifying our notion of identity is these two concepts. So two necessary conditions, required conditions to say something is identity or strict identity, is that the object must be invariable, the object must be uninterrupted in its existence. So we have this kind of tendency to ascribe identity to objects that are variable and uninterrupted. But this is not merely a dispute of words. There are reasons why we make this mistake, and these reasons are the three relations responsible for the belief that variable and interrupted objects are identical. And these three are ones we've talked about a lot. So resemblance, contiguity, and causation. So to kind of prove the point, we must show that all objects which we take to be the same object, despite changes, are in fact not the same object at all. So these three relations are responsible for our beliefs in variable and uninterrupted objects as identical. And they're the ones that are about to come up in this paragraph 7. So, thus the controversy concerning identity is not merely a dispute of words, for when we attribute identity in an improper sense to variable or interrupted objects, our mistake is not confined to the expression, but is commonly attended with a fiction, either of something invariable or uninterrupted, or of something mysterious and inexplicable, or at least with the propensity to such fiction. What will suffice to prove this hypothesis to the satisfaction of the fair inquirer is to shew from daily experience and observation that the objects which are variable or interrupted and yet are supposed to continue the same are such only as consist of a succession of parts connected together by resemblance, contiguity, and causation. So like we said, these three elements are super, super important. So they're the major issues in falsely identifying a self. When we think about a lot of arguments about what personal identity is or what the self is and how we understand that, these are the three means in which Hume thinks we relate this variable interrupted objects as a singular, same identical thing, same person, same concept over time. If it is a plant, if it's an animal, whatever, something that is changing and variable, that is actually just related, not strictly identical. So it says, so for such a succession answers evidently to our notion of diversity. It can only be by mistake we ascribe to it an identity, and as the relation of parts which leads us to this into this mistake is really nothing but a quality which produces an association of ideas and an easy transition of the imagination from one to another. It can only be from the resemblance which this act of the mind bears to that by which we contemplate one continued object that the error arises. Our chief business then must be to prove that all objects to which we ascribe identity, without observing their invariableness and uninterruptedness, are such as consist of a succession of related objects. So what he's talking about here, again, invariable and uninterrupted is the conditions for identity. And in very strict view, Hume would say that any changes are actually different identity or different self. So unless invariable or uninterrupted, it is a succession of related objects versus a continuous self. This kind of leads us on to paragraph 8. In order to this, suppose any mass of matter of which the parts are contiguous. This leads us on to paragraph 8. So in order to this, suppose any mass of matter of which the parts are contiguous and connected to be placed before us. 'Tis plain we must attribute a perfect identity to this mass, provided all the parts continue uninterruptedly and invariably the same, whatever motion or change of place we may observe either in the whole or in any of its parts. But supposing some very small or inconsiderable part is added to the mass, or subtracted from it, though this absolutely destroys the identity of the whole, strictly speaking, yet as we seldom think so accurately, we scruple not to pronounce a mass of matter the same, where we find so trivial an altercation. So pretty much just saying we don't we hesitate to not say that it's the same, or we're reluctant to not assume this mass of matter, even if there's been some trivial change to it, is not the same anymore. But for Hume, you would have to say that they kind of are. So imagine this mass of matter, whatever, despite moving like through time, space, changes not at all in terms of matter in which it consists. Only in this case, if it does not change at all, can it be said to accurately be able to ascribe identity to it. It is invariable and uninterrupted. But, and what he's trying to say here, even if we usually hesitate or reluctant to say that it's not the same anymore, if we add or subtract even a very small or inconsiderable part, then it would destroy the identity. It would no longer be the same mass of matter. Any changes, no matter how small, any interruptions, any variability means that we cannot say it is the strict identity, the strict self. This is Hume's almost hardline view. Where this leads us, so the very end of this extract, the passage of the thought from the object before the change to the object after it is so smooth and easy that we scarce perceive the transition and are apt to imagine that 'tis nothing but a continued survey of the same object. So this is our tendency to think about sameness, to not actually see that there is a difference or a change in the mass, when really it is no longer the same mass of matter in this view. So now looking at extract 2, just thought I'd break them up a little bit. So as you can see on the page, this is the bottom of 306. This is labelled as paragraph 15 because of the gap within it. So let's get into it. We now proceed to explain the nature of personal identity, which has become so great a question in philosophy, especially of late years in England, where all the abstruser sciences are studied with a peculiar ardour and application, and here it is evident the same method of reasoning must be continued, which has so successfully explained the identity of plants and animals and ships and houses and of all the compounded and changeable productions either of art or nature. So he's talking about this method that he's appealing to is this concept of empiricism, is the method of saying that should be employed. So sense evidence, being able to see, feel, taste, touch, solidly, observably see that something is the same. So what kind of concept he's trying to bring about is this illusion of self-identity. So just like the identity of plants, animals, and ships, personal identity is a mere fiction. The actual relation that exists between a person at 2 points in time is diversity, is distinctness. So not a singular fixed self, always changing, distinct being from one point in time to another point in time. So where it ends up, so the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. It cannot, therefore, have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. So, again, personal identity as an illusion. That is what it's really bringing about. So the illusion of a human self to the same minimal extent we describe a self to, say, a plant or an animal. You don't really look at like a pot plant and say that there is a continuing self. And to that same extent, it is a fiction that the humans have a fixed single self. This leads us into 16. But lest this argument should not convince the reader, though in my opinion perfectly decisive, let him weigh the following reasoning, which is still closer and more immediate. 'Tis evident that the identity which we attribute to the human mind, however perfect we may imagine it to be, is not able to run the several different perceptions into one and make them lose their character of distinction and difference, which are essential to them. So what he's suggesting is it is the essential nature of perceptions to be separate from one another. There cannot be, therefore, identity between the different perceptions, for if there were, we would lose the independence or of their characteristics. So we talk about perceptions as these differing, changing things. We can't then say that there are identical perceptions at all time. We can't have all of these continuous same perceptions always. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the distinctness that we have in our experiences of our perceptions. So we're kind of up to around here. 'Tis still true that every distinct perception which enters into the composition of the mind is a distinct existence, and is different and distinguishable and separate from every other perception, either contemporary or successive. So again, this is talking about this idea, differing perceptions, they are characterized as distinct and separate. So we cannot take them as this thing that is always continual and always ongoing. We have different perceptions. They take over for one another. They are successive but distinct. But as notwithstanding, so I'll scroll to that part, this distinction and separability, we suppose the whole train of perceptions to be united by identity. A question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity, whether it be something that really binds our several perceptions together or only associates their ideas in the imagination. That is, in other words, whether in pronouncing concerning the identity of a person, we observe some real bond among his perceptions or only feel one among the ideas we form of them. So this section here where it's talking about this concerning the reality of a person, concerning the way we talk about it, pretty much just brings up this point about even if it feels like there is something that unites all of our perceptions together, we are mistaken, for we never observe any real connection between objects, and it is simply our imagination which is forming connections and bringing together these perceptions. So even if it feels like there's something that unites all perceptions, it's a mistake, and it's really our imagination that is almost tricking us and fooling us into believing that there is a connection between these objects. So when we're then up to is this question, we might easily decide if we would recollect what has already been proved at large, that the understanding never observes any real connection among objects, and that even the union of cause and effect, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. So real connection is kind of never observed amongst objects. Again, it is really imagination, and instead it is actually just an association of ideas rather than a strict identity of them. So from there, it evidently follows that identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together, but is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of their ideas in the imagination when we reflect upon them. So we give unity to our perceptions through imagination, and it's really about reflection versus identity. We only know about them and we only have this notion of identity through the reflection in our imagination that links these differing concepts. Now, the only qualities which can give ideas of union in the imagination are these three relations above mentioned. So again, this is resemblance, contiguity, and causation. These are the uniting principles in the ideal world, and without them, every distinct object is separable by the mind and may be separately considered and appears not to have any more connections with any other object than if disjoined by the greatest difference and remoteness. 'Tis therefore on some of these three relations of resemblance, contiguity, and causation that identity depends. And as the very essence of these relations consists in their producing an easy transition of ideas, it follows that our notion of personal identity proceeds entirely from a smooth and uninterrupted progress of the thought along the train of connected ideas, according to the principle above explained. So, kind of big element here, according to Hume, the mind consists of a succession of distinct perceptions, many of which are past copies of current perceptions. The ability of memory to produce copies is linked to this train of thought idea, where it's saying that we have a train of thought, one thought leads us to another. We only are able to do that through connections within memory, and that will be further explained in some of the later ideas. But the big concept, especially finishing off 16 and as we go into 17, is that these three relations that lie behind the imagination's tendency to attribute relation between otherwise distinct objects are this resemblance, contiguity, and causation. And the two relations that are responsible for the illusion of a unified continuous mind, and the ones that he will focus on, are specifically resemblance and causation only. So 17 again is very short, so it's just the only question therefore which remains is by what relations this uninterrupted progress of our thoughts is produced when we consider the successive existence of a mind or thinking person. And here 'tis evidence we must confine ourselves to resemblance and causation, and must drop contiguity, which has little or no influence in the present case. So this is where he says that we really should only focus on resemblance and contiguity, and causation. So 18 then. To begin with resemblance, suppose we could see clearly into the breast of another and observe that succession of perceptions which constitute his mind or thinking principle, and suppose that he always preserves the memory of a considerable part of past perceptions. 'Tis evident that nothing could contribute to the bestowing a relation of this succession amidst all of its variations. For what is memory but a faculty by which we raise up the images of past perceptions? So he's pretty much just saying the usage of memory to attribute relations between current and past perceptions, that our imagination finds memories of past perceptions that then attribute relations. So if we didn't have past memories, we wouldn't be able to say that something resembles something else. This is that element of memory and causation that memory and resemblance that we've talked about in class, where we're saying that this link between how we attribute something to resemble something else relies on having that background knowledge and understanding of what that thing is from a memory of it. So looking kind of here, and as image necessarily resembles its object, must not the frequent placing of these resembling perceptions in the chain of thought convey the imagination more easily from one link to another and make the whole seem like a continuance of one object? So element kind of important here. So it's saying memory creates a seemingly uninterrupted stream of consciousness consisting of a succession of distinct perceptions. So because we have the memory of previous things, it makes it easier for us to link one to another and make the whole seem like a continuance of one object. So where it kind of leads into is this part where it says, in this particular, then memory not only discovers identity but also contributes to its production by producing the relation of resemblance among the perceptions. The case is the same whether we consider ourselves or others. So memory creates this stream of consciousness, or this seeming stream of consciousness, which brings about a continuation of our perceptions. It feels as though there is these links between them. So then it says the case is the same whether we consider ourselves or others. So it doesn't matter if we're considering about my perceptions or another's perceptions. Memory and resemblance link these concepts together. All right. 19. So then we look at causation. So 18 is about resemblance, 19 then is about the other relational principle, which is causation. As to causation, we may observe that the true idea of the human mind is to consider it as a system of different perceptions or different existences which are linked together by the relation of cause and effect and mutually produce, destroy, influence, and modify each other. So, kind of big element here, cause and effect is pretty much what creates the illusion of personal identity, that our thoughts, our consciousness, our mind continues uninterrupted. Our constant inferences or ideas that something is causing something else, that something is bringing it about among our perceptions. So think about like imagining that objects cause responses from our senses, and our imagining that prior impressions affect future impressions and so forth. This leads us to assume identity when there is none. So our impressions give rise to the corresponding ideas. This is what we're reading, and these links these ideas in their turn produce other impressions. One thought chases another and draws after it a third, by which it is expelled in its turn. In this respect, I cannot compare the soul more properly to anything than to a republic or commonwealth. So just before we go into the commonwealth analogy, it's just kind of bringing up this idea that our perceptions are constantly changing, really, and replacing one another. He says one thought chases another, and in the third, by which, and so on, because we imagine constant causal relations linking actually distinct perceptions, so things that aren't related. A misleading sense of coherent, uninterrupted train of ideas arises and is thus mistakenly used to ascribe or say that there is identity, because we are looking at it as a cause and effect chain when really that isn't correct. From here, then, we'll look at the republic analogy, as we went over in class, but it's obviously very good to talk about it. So, I cannot compare the soul more properly to anything than to a republic or commonwealth in which the several members are united by the reciprocal ties of government and subordination, and give rise to other persons who propagate the same republic in the incessant changes of its part. And as the same individual republic may not only change its members, but also its laws and constitutions, in like manner the same person may vary his character and disposition, as well as his impressions and ideas, without losing his identity. Whatever changes he endures, his several parts are still connected by the relation of causation, and in this view our identity with regard to the passions serve to corroborate that with regard to the imagination, by the making of our distant perceptions influence each other, and by giving us a present concern for our past or future pains or pleasures. This analogy and this idea is kind of bringing up that so members of the republic are the different perceptions, and the government is the principle of causation. It's kind of seeming to link the members and create a coherent whole that persists over time. The members, like perceptions, are changing and separate, and just like perceptions, due to this change, we cannot say the republic has true identity. We must only equate true identity to something that is invariable and uninterrupted, and like perceptions, the republic or commonwealth is interrupted and changed, and thus doesn't have true identity. So this leads us on again to move on to 20. As memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, 'tis to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. Had we no memory, we never should have any notion of causation, nor consequently of that chain of causes and effects which constitute ourself or person. But having once acquired this notion of causation from the memory, we can extend the same chain of causes and consequently the identity of our persons beyond our memory, and can comprehend times and circumstances and actions which we have entirely forgot but suppose in general to have existed. So this element of causation, of this link to memory, is very important. It's pretty much just saying memory is essential to personal identity, and this is because it is memory which both creates the illusion of continuity in our perceptions and allows us to recognize the chain of causes and effects which constitute ourselves. When it talks specifically about saying that, well, it allows us to extend our memory beyond ourselves, this kind of alleviates some of the gap issues within even Locke's text, where it's saying that there isn't the same self if you don't have the memories. This takes that away slightly by saying, well, this chain of cause and effects, when linked to memory, when linked to resemblance, remember these as our three concepts are sufficient, they give us this seeming connected element, this identity link beyond our memory itself, which is fallible, which can have gaps or points that we have forgotten. Which is pretty much what it's about to talk about. So this is the, for how few of our past actions are there of which we have any memory. Who can tell me, for instance, what were his thoughts and actions on the 1st of January 1715, or the 11th of March 1719, or the 3rd of August 1733? Obviously, at this time period, these were past events that people would actually be alive during and be able to tell about. So, think about it as January 2015 or March 2019, August 2021, 2020, let's say, just to keep it in time frame that we would be alive. Or will he affirm, because he has entirely forgot the incidents of these days, that the present self is not the same person with the self of that time, and by that means overturn all of the most established notions of personal identity? So again, it's kind of linking this idea that Locke would say that we are not the same self if we do not have the memories. So it feels wrong to bring about this idea. So what he's saying is memory alone is not enough. If we utilize just memory, we'd fall under the issues that Locke has, where if we kind of use memory alone, we fall under the trap that Locke has, where we must say that we are not the same self if we have these gaps. So memory alone is not enough, and instead it must be united with resemblance and with causation to tell us enough to prove a self. So that's where he comes into talking about this idea. So in this view, therefore, memory does not so much produce as discover personal identity by showing us the relation of cause and effect among our different perceptions. 'Twill be incumbent on those who affirm that memory produces entirely our personal identity to give reason why we can thus extend our identity beyond memory. So for Locke, if we say that identity is how we posit, if we say memory is how we posit identity, well, why can we extend our identity beyond our memory? It would be an issue if our memory is the basis of personal identity alone. We would then not be able to extend our identity beyond our memory, and Hume's understanding is that we are able to do that, and because of resemblance, because of cause and effect, we are able to thus extend it beyond simply just memory. And it gives more of a broader understanding of this concept of a whole. Wislin's leads us is 221. So the whole of this document leads to a conclusion. So he's going to kind of give us a main idea of what he said, which is of great importance to the present affair. That all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided, and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than as philosophical difficulties. Identity depends on the relation of ideas, and these relations produce identity by means of that easy transition they occasion. But as the relations and the easiness of the transition may diminish by insensible degrees, we have no just standard by which we can decide any dispute concerning the time when they acquire or lose a title to the name of identity. All the disputes concerning the identity of connected objects are merely verbal, except so far as the relation of parts gives rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed. So, conclusion: identity depends on the relation of ideas by virtue of the easy transition they create. But as there is no rule by which we can demonstrate the transition was sufficient to retain identity, all disputes of personal identity are merely verbal or products of the imagination. So thus, for Hume, memory, causation, and resemblance are jointly sufficient for the illusion of personal identity, because there is no demonstrable or really identifiable self or identity. This leads us into our very, very last part. 23 is a bit irrelevant. It's just leading into the rest of the document, but 22 gives us a tiny little bit more that is important. So what I have said concerning the first origin and uncertainty of our notion of identity as applied to the human mind may be extended with little or no variation to that of simplicity. An object whose different coexistent parts are bound together by a close relation, operate upon the imagination after which the same manner as one perfectly simple and indivisible, and require not a much greater stretch of thought in order to its conception. From this similarity of operation, we attribute a simplicity to it, and feign the principle of union as the support of this simplicity, and the centre of all the different parts and qualities of the object. So, what we say about identity applies equally to simplicity. If the kind of coexisting parts of an object are bound together closely enough, so in one way or another, almost this idea of contiguity that we kind of looked over earlier, the imagination will view the object as simple, and we will again be tempted to feign imagined simplicity or sameness. So because they're seemingly in such close relation, this is back to kind of our contiguity argument of this idea of closeness, of this seeming sameness, which is actually just false. Cool. And paragraph 23, just to very quickly go over. Thus we have finished our examination of the several systems of philosophy, both of the intellectual and natural world, and in a miscellaneous way of reasoning have been led into several topics which will either illustrate or confirm some preceding part of this discourse, or prepare the way for our following opinions. It is now time to return to a more close examination of our subject, and to proceed in the accurate anatomy of human nature, having fully explained the nature of our judgment and understanding. So like I said, not very relevant to the debate on personal identity, but a general link.